Right now, Amazon is offering some amazing extra perks that come with a job offer. If you start a warehouse job, you can get a $1,000 sign-on bonus. That means you start earning a paycheck right away, plus you get extra cash to use before the holidays. Applying is so easy, you don't even need an interview. It's never been so rewarding to start an hourly job that's close to home. So what are you waiting for? To join the team today, visit amazon.com/sign-on bonus. Amazon is an equal opportunity employer.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back to the year 1881 and looking at the 20th President of the United States, President James Garfield. Now, Garfield has two distinctions in American history. First, he was the second president in American history to be assassinated. Of course, the first was Abraham Lincoln. And second, he has the second shortest presidency in American history. The shortest president, of course, belonged to Whig William Henry Harrison. But James Garfield comes in a close second. So, Chris, we're looking at a president who is going to serve a very short term in office because he was assassinated.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. Yes, he was the 20th president of the United States, but really he didn't choose the presidency. The presidency kind of chose him. He kind of is this middle of the road candidate that they can't really find anybody else. They need to compromise. And so at the Republican convention, after the party has just kind of been divided, they just, after like 36 ballots, they say, well, I guess we'll just go with Garfield. And so it's interesting that here's Garfield, who refuses to go campaigning, refuses to really politic. Instead, he says, hey, if you want to hear about me, come to my front porch, because he's very big on doing front porch campaigning, where he speaks to the voters and to the reporters, and he becomes president. And when he becomes president, he is finding himself in the midst of a system, a bureaucracy, if you will, that is all about getting something in return for helping somebody become president. And that's going to really set the whole thing in motion as far as what happens to him a little bit later in his presidency. It's also interesting that one of his closest advisors was another individual who we'll talk about later in the story, but was very familiar with assassinations, and his name was Robert Lincoln.
Yeah, and that is a very interesting point, Chris. The Robert Lincoln connection between both Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield is a very fascinating connection there. And it's unfortunate in many ways, I think, that James Garfield, that when people think about James Garfield, if people ever think about James Garfield, what most people think about is he was assassinated. Charles Guiteau shot him in a train station. That's what most people think about if and when they do think about James Garfield. But this was a very religious man. This was a very educated man. And this was a very loyal man, a patriotic man. I mean, this man went to seminary. He knew Greek and Latin. He had been to a college. He had graduated from college. He studied. He passed the Ohio bar. When the Civil War came along in 1861, he joined the army. He was he was a head of an infantry unit. He was made a colonel. I mean, this man had a very impressive resume, even at that point in his life. And then, of course, when he's first elected to the United States Senate, he's still serving in the army, and he won't go home to take his seat. He holds out in the army until, it's okay for him to leave and then go back and take his seat. So this is a man who, it's not surprising that in 1880, when the Republican convention sort of settled on him and chose him sort of this dark horse candidate, that he would say, yeah, okay, I'll do it, even though that wasn't necessarily the direction his life was going.
Yeah, and not only did he not want to do it, but when he finally decided that, yes, this is my calling, this is the plan that's been laid out for me, he goes at it with everything that he has. And due to that loyalty and the dedication and really this just hard charging attitude, because honestly, Before he even goes to that train station that day, he's actually running a little late because he said, listen, I can't take a holiday without first doing business. And the people have not paid me to always go on vacation. So he was determined to get his work done. And while he even was going on vacation, I think he was going to a college reunion, and he was going to go hang out with his wife at the summer home. But he even instructed the cabinet members to go with him on the train so that he could still do the nation's business, if you will. And I think it was that dedication and that determination that actually got Charles Guiteau involved with James Garfield, because when Guiteau hears and sees James Garfield accept the nomination for president at the Republican convention, and Guiteau says, look, I'm leaving. I'm going to Washington, D.C. to help this man get elected. And he will work hard in ensuring that Garfield will become president. Now, when we say what was Guiteau doing working hard, he's going out, he's doing what we typically see people do today to help candidates get elected for office. You go door to door, you knock, you pass out pamphlets, and Guiteau feels like, hey, I have had a major role in getting this guy president of the United States. And therefore, I'm not just hoping, but I am expecting that this new president is going to remember me going door to door, passing out pamphlets, and he's going to reward me for it.
Yeah, and Charles Guiteau, I think this is a good place, Chris, to really introduce him a little more. You gave a good sort of survey of some of what he was doing for James Garfield. Guiteau was a 41-year-old man. He had a law practice. He had passed the bar. He never really amounted to much as a lawyer, and he left law to get involved in politics. Then he was a big supporter of Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant, of course, was sort of looking at maybe running again for maybe a third term here. And Guiteau was supporting Grant. Well, when Garfield got the nomination, as you've already discussed, Guiteau just sort of changed his loyalties. He just sort of switched from Grant to Garfield and was giving the same little speech, little spiel he was giving. It was exact same spiel, except he sort of scribbled out Grant's name and put in Garfield's name. But he actually, he's more than just a 41-year-old man who was supporting Garfield and then didn't get a job in the Garfield administration like he wanted, which was really what he wanted, this sort of patronage system. I had supported you for president. Now I expect a job from you. I expect a job in your administration. And he didn't get it. He's more than just a disgruntled office seeker. This man was mentally ill.
Well, and I think we got to go back as you were introducing him and understand that long before he even meets Garfield, he even states, what can I do with my life? I am so unhappy. Nothing pleases me. You mentioned that he passed the bar. Before he passed the bar, he had actually done a couple of other things. He got involved in something that his father was at one time involved in, which was the Oneida community in New York. And that was that group that basically kind of migrated to being by themselves, wanting to bring about a utopia type of society. And some people would say it was kind of what's known as millennial communism. And so he was involved in that. And then he found out, no, I really don't like that. His mom dies when he's 5 years old. His dad then deserts the family. He's raised by his sister. And his sister basically has to take care of him, providing him moral support, financial support, all of these things. His sister gets married, and it's actually his brother-in-law that sets him up in a law firm and actually tries to help him make it as being a lawyer. But Ray, there's two things that happen in his life before meeting Garfield that kind of says, uh-oh, this guy's got some issues. And the first thing is that when he becomes a lawyer, he sets up this small private practice and he marries a young lady by the name of Annie Bunn, who's a librarian at the local YMCA. And it's there that he starts to share how there are voices that start coming into his mind and telling him what to do, and that Guiteau begins to obey them. And the first voice that he hears tells him that he needs to show his wife who's in charge. And so he is domestically abusing his wife. He does this for like 7 days. He locks her in the closet. He beats her up. And finally, she runs and gets a divorce. And so he goes back and lives with his sister or his brother-in-law. And then one day, his sister, Frances, is going out into the backyard, and there's Guiteau, who's chopping wood with an axe. And she passes pretty close to him, and he just has a moment. He gets so upset, and he takes the axe and has the intent of bringing it down upon her head. And Frances remembers years later, she says, just as I remembered, my brother was going to try to kill me. I knew then something was wrong with him, and I feared of what might happen.
Yeah, this was an unstable man and a dangerous man. You talk about him hearing voices in his head. He writes a letter to Garfield shortly after Garfield, of course, refuses to give him a job in his administration. He writes a letter to Garfield talking about he's about to marry a wealthy and accomplished heiress in this city. The problem was there was no such person, at least as far as we know, there was no such person. But he is very upset about not being given a job. And he now believes he has a mission, not just simply to himself, but also to the people of the United States, to the Republican Party, and to God even, to kill James Garfield. He said that it was his intention to kill Garfield. But if it makes anything any better, Chris, he also said he didn't want to hurt Garfield. He didn't want Garfield to suffer. He just wanted to kill Garfield.
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, when we keep talking about this job, and he actually gets an appointment and goes to the White House and meets face to face with Garfield to press his case. And the job that he wanted, it was not like Secretary of State or Secretary of War or anything like that. But the job he wanted was like to be the counsel to Hong Kong. I mean, it was one of those weird positions, but it was a job that he thought that he deserved, but it was a job that was already given to a guy whose name was John Singleton Mosby. And so he didn't have a chance to get it. And Garfield basically was just like, dude, I'm sorry. I appreciate you going door to door and helping me out here, but that's about all I can do is say thank you. And
thank you, but no thanks.
Yeah. I mean, and so for then this guy to just say, it's my mission to kill you, but I'm gonna kill you, but not hurt. I remember the story. He actually had a chance to kill Garfield earlier than when he actually shot him. And the reason he said he didn't do it is because Garfield's wife, which I think her name was Cleet, I might have that wrong, but Garfield's wife had just gotten sick, and she was very depressed and just very down. And Guiteau was like, oh man, I don't want to shoot this guy right here in front of his wife. That will actually destroy her too. And I'm not in the business of that. I've just got one mission by God, and it's to kill Garfield. And so he actually stops and waits until Garfield is making his way to the train station.
Yeah, and he actually had another attempt to kill Garfield, or opportunity to kill Garfield, but there were other people around him, and he was worried about hurting one of them. In fact, before he actually came to the idea of shooting Garfield, he had thought about using dynamite, but he was afraid that was, quote, too Russian and too barbarous, end quote, because it would kill or injure a lot of people around it. So he comes to the conclusion, after going through several options, he comes down to the conclusion the best thing to do is to shoot him. So he goes and he gets a gun, a 44 caliber. The gun was a 44 caliber British Bulldog revolver. And it's interesting why he got that gun. Number one, it was in his price range. It was a $10 gun, which of course $10 then was much more than $10 today. But also, Chris, he thought it would display well in an exhibit about the president's assassination. So he's not only thinking, well, it's my mission to kill Garfield for the United States. This man is so delusional. He thinks people are going to honor him and put exhibits up about him and about his heroic act of killing the president. This is a man, Chris, who is more than just simply a disgruntled office seeker. This man is unstable and dangerous.
Yeah, and he really believed, that the Smithsonian was going to reward him. But until his last breath, he honestly believed in his mind that he was doing this on behalf of God and his country, that this was the right thing to do. But as we've talked about, the only real issue that he has is he didn't get the job.
Yeah.
But he wants revenge. And so unfortunately, once again, the newspaper has a lot to do with this. The newspaper during this day publishes the president's schedule. Everybody knows where the president's going to be, when he's going to be there. So Guiteau knew that the president was going to be at the train station and where he was going. And that was his perfect opportunity. And, you mentioned this gun that he has. And so he's there, he's waiting around, and here comes the president along with, several of his friends that are there. And Guiteau takes the gun, that revolver, and shoots. And there's this huge bang, and Garfield turns around and he's got a sting in his shoulder because the bullet just grazed him. And what's interesting is that I think Guiteau didn't recognize the power of the gun. He didn't understand the heavy recoil. And so Guiteau actually falls backwards, right? Which is why that first bullet kind of goes, off. And then he says, I'm determined not to be a failure. I've got to make this a mission. And so Garfield turns around after experiencing the graze and thinking, what on earth is going on? He actually says, my God, what is this? And the next thing you know is he's looking face to face with Guiteau, not really knowing that's the guy that he had just turned down for a job just a few days earlier. And Guiteau fires that second time. And when he fires that second time, it's when the bullet will go directly into Garfield's back. Fortunately, there was a doctor that was there from Howard University. And so Garfield falls down. The doctor, Dr. Rayburn, goes up to him. Mr. President, are you badly hurt? To which Garfield says, I am. I am afraid I am.
Yeah, our listeners would probably be surprised that the President of the United States would be so exposed, that someone could get that close to him. But you have to understand, while the Secret Service was first put together during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, I think it wasn't until 1894 that they actually began protecting presidents. Up to that point, Thomas Jefferson or John Adams could just go out and walk down the street and nobody would really think anything of it. And in fact, there is a story, I don't know how true it is, but there's a story that if you had knocked on the White House door during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, he would have answered the door. I mean, can you imagine going to the White House and knocking on the door and the president answering the door? Probably.
And he answered it in his slippers and his bathrobe.
Slippers and bathrobe, absolutely. So yes, James Garfield was very vulnerable. He was very exposed. And of course, this man, and we didn't really get into this, but this man had been stalking him for some time. And of course, nobody had caught on to that. Nobody had figured out, all right, the president's in danger and up the security. No, the president's just there in the train station, the Baltimore and Potomac rail station there in Washington, D.C. He's on his way to New Jersey, and he is shot. Like you said, that you did a very good job describing the events of his assassination. But he doesn't die, Chris. Instead, he is taken back to the White House. And I found a description, Chris, of the conditions of the White House where he's initially taken. He's taken to the White House. Of course, it's hot. It's over 100 degrees outside at this particular point in time. He's taken to the White House where a number of doctors with dirty and unwashed hands stick their finger into the bullet hole, trying to retrieve the bullet that went into his back, into his abdomen. They use tools that have not been disinfected, that were dirty, and they're digging around in his abdomen looking for the bullet. They inject him with morphine, which of course makes him sick. And they just do all of this horrible stuff, absolutely torturing their man. There may have been a time, Chris, when he thought, man, I would just like to die, just stop doing this. Whatever you're doing, just stop. And it is interesting at this particular point in time, there wasn't a belief in a lot of medical practice of using very sterile equipment. There was a British doctor, in fact, by the name of Joseph Lister, who had said, look, you need to clean your hands, you need to clean the equipment before using it on the president or anybody else. And one American doctor responded and said, and I quote, in order to successfully practice Mr. Lister's antiseptic method, it is necessary that we should believe or act as if we believe that the atmosphere to be loaded with germs, end quote. I mean, so they were actually doing more harm to Garfield after he was shot than probably the shot itself did, because the shot, the bullet, when it went in, it didn't hit any major organs. You know, he would have lived today easily. If they had used sterile equipment, he probably would have lived.
And we talk about if they would have used the equipment, if they would have, done these things that they probably know that they should have done. And here's the sad part, that we have this tragic story that takes on an even greater tragedy in it. First of all, Robert Lincoln, who have already experienced what had happened to his dad, now seeing this again, he automatically turns into, I've got to do something. I've got to, get things going. And so he basically makes the decision to take the president to the White House. And then he's got to say, okay, I've got to find some really good doctors that are going to be able to do things. And the first person that he thinks of is this guy whose name is Dr. Willard Bliss. And Dr. Willard Bliss had actually been one of the doctors that had been on scene with Robert's father, Abraham Lincoln. In addition, Dr. Bliss was also really good friends with James Garfield. So this sounds like it's excellent, right? You've got Dr. Bliss, who's already been there with one president, who is good friends with the second president who has now been shot. You would think, what greater person would you rather have than Dr. Bliss? But here's the issue. What Robert Lincoln didn't know, what James Garfield didn't know, is that Bliss had been prevented from even touching Abraham Lincoln because they felt that he wasn't a good doctor. And so they were worried. And so they chose somebody else to treat the father. And it really ticked off Bliss, because he never forgot that another doctor had been given the opportunity to explore for the bullet in Lincoln's head. And so Bliss said, you know what? I don't forget that. And so when he is called to help Garfield, he comes in and he says, you know what? I learned from Lincoln's assassination. No one is going to shut me out this time. And so all of a sudden, this doctor trades in on his friendship with the president. Robert says, sure, you call the shots. And it is this doctor that does exactly what you say. Not only does he determine the course of the president's treatment, not only does he say who can and who cannot go into the room, but it is this guy who starts using his dirty fingers, who starts using all of these other tools, who basically starts manipulating the president's condition, because he wants fame. He wants to be remembered. And he says, I have finally been given the opportunity to explore for a bullet in the body of the president of the United States. And I'm not going to let anyone tell me what I can do or what I can't do. I am going to be operating, and the other people are going to be watching. And that, as you said, is a huge mistake in what's going to cause the president to lose his life.
Yeah, and the president is going to lay in that bed in the White House. We'll talk about in a minute. He's eventually going to be moved to New Jersey, but his condition just goes downhill, having nothing to do with the bullet wound, but having everything to do with the unsanitary way in which he was treated. His body is full of infection. His face is swelling. He's got pus that has to be drained. He loses nearly 100 pounds because the doctors won't let him eat properly. I mean, this man is in very, very bad shape into July and August of 1881. And he's eventually moved to a oceanfront cottage in Long Beach, New Jersey. And Chris, it's very, very touching. Every once in a while, you read a story where, you sort of restores your faith in humanity a little bit. And this is one of those stories as he's being brought into New Jersey, the residents of this town, Long Branch, New Jersey, they hear this sick president's coming to town, and they say, well, you know what? If he rides the train here, he's going to have to get off the train and get in a buggy and bounce all the way to the house on the rough roads. So they spent 24 hours, Chris, building an extension onto the railroad track so that the train could literally take President Garfield right to the house where he needs to be. He could hear the ocean. It was a little cooler than what it was in Washington, D.C. And, Garfield was optimistic at this point about his chances of recovery. He writes to his mom on August 11, 1881, and he says, don't be disturbed by what you're hearing, reports about my condition. He says, and I quote, I am still weak and on my back, but I am gaining every day and needing only time and patience to bring me through, end quote. And so he's writing his mom that kind of letter. And according to people who were around him, he remains positive the entire time. But Chris, one thing he did not do, and that was he did not activate Vice President Chester Arthur. He remained, though he was in bed and very sick in July and August and early September, he never activated the vice president. He remained, the nation pretty much did not have a president for those 2 months.
Didn't have a president. All the world is watching. The nation is watching. Everyone is attuned to the president's grave condition. And there's two interesting people that also play a role in this that's going on the medical and / science part of this. You mentioned that they decide that they've got to move Garfield because it is the heat and the humidity of the July summer. One of the other interesting things about this people might not be aware of, but all of the waste and all of the sewage of Washington, D.C. went right down by the White House. And it was one of the worst smelling places that you could ever be. And that was one of the reasons they also wanted to get him out of the White House. When he actually gets to the place you were talking about, there is a letter, there's some other discussion that they were so thankful for the fresh smell of flowers and clean air, and they didn't smell the waste that was going by the White House. But one other thing that happened that they needed to get the president out of the White House because of the heat and humidity is they were afraid that he was dehydrated and that he was going to die from dehydration. And I found it interesting that we get to be introduced to this guy whose name was Simon Newcomb, and he will later become one of America's greatest astronomers. And he comes in and they say, hey, we need your help in trying to find a way to cool down the president's body temperature. We're afraid he's going to die because he's getting dehydrated. And so Newcomb creates a device that is able to force air over ice blocks. And by forcing air over these ice blocks, it lowers the room temperature by about 20 degrees. So what we have during Garfield's tragic shooting is the world's first air conditioner.
Yep.
But Newcomb doesn't have time to really pat himself on the back because he's still trying to deal with how to get the president's bullet out of the back. But Ray, the other guy that we just need to mention really quick is the guy that we use his invention all of the time, but we might fail to remember the beauty of Alexander Graham Bell. And he had a role in this also.
Yeah, he was brought in. He had invented a metal detector, and he was brought in to try to, run it over, I guess, Garfield's abdomen to see if they could locate the bullet. The only problem, it's my understanding, is that he was laying on a metal spring bed. So, of course, the metal detector was not that much help. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and go along with that, you're right. He tried this experiment 3 times. He called it something like induction balance. And he practiced on some Confederate soldiers. He had practiced on some other things, and he knew it worked. And so the first time they say, oh my gosh, yeah, you're on this metal bed, so that's what's causing the issue. But here's the other thing that many people fail to remember that actually happened. Alexander Graham Bell invented this contraption, this device. Alexander Graham Bell knew how it worked. And Alexander Graham Bell was not allowed to actually perform that procedure on the president. Rather, who was the one that performed it? It was Dr. Bliss, because Dr. Bliss knew that if it worked, the person who did it would get the credit. And so Bliss was determined that it was going to be him. But then when it failed, Dr. Bliss said, I've got to look good. So he blames Alexander Graham Bell. And actually Bell said, dude, I know it works. Give me one more chance. And Ray, the sad thing is that Alexander Graham Bell knew that this worked because he had tested it one more time. And so this is like the third time of using this metal detector. And Bliss goes in and actually literally directs the metal detector away from where the bullet actually was in the body of Garfield. And I think that just continues to remind us that Bliss is determined to get credit. Whether he lives or he dies, doesn't matter. Bliss wants the credit. And Ray, I know that our time is running short, but after Bell's invention doesn't work, Bliss actually decides to do something else. And I don't know if you did the research on this, but I was fascinated by it. But Bliss decided that the next thing he needed to do was to try a treatment that the Egyptians had done. And that way, and that process was basically by making sure that the individual had food that he was able to be able to eat in a way. But the way that he did it is through a process that was called, I don't know how to say it, except feeding per rectum is what they called it. And Bliss's idea was that he was going to pump food up the president's rectum, which was going to be an artificial method of sustaining life. And when this happened, it was considered to be torture, and that President Garfield was in extreme pain, and he just had a hard time. He didn't want anything else to happen because he was just in so much pain. So I think it goes to see that we have a doctor who has been rejected, who is trying for fame and is using all of these weird, unorthodox ways to try to save the president, when in actuality, he's killing the president.
Yeah, what a terrible series of events. And, you know, medicine in the mid to late 19th century certainly was not what it is today or what you would want it to be. You know, and by the time they brought in Bell, and it was probably too late. The infection was too far advanced and they didn't have antibiotics. So it was probably just a matter of time. And James Garfield, the 20th president of the United States, succumbed on September 19, 1881, at the age of 49 years old. And you know what, Chris? He didn't die from the bullet directly. He died from the work of these doctors and their unsanitary treatment options. And of course, Charles Guiteau is going to go on trial for the president, for the murder of the president. And you know what his number one defense argument was? The doctors killed Garfield. I just shot him. And you know what, Chris? In a way, he was right.
Yeah, he was absolutely right, because Dr. Bliss, when they did the autopsy of Garfield and they started looking, what they discovered is that you had Dr. Bliss, who had gone into what at one point was a 3-inch entry wound. And because of all of his probing and sticking his fingers in and all of that, he had created a wound that was now 21 inches long. And it was a false wound, because instead of going towards the bullet, it was going away from the bullet. And doing all of this feeding through the rectum and all of this blood infusions, I mean, he was suffering from extensive blood poisoning. So the cause of death was more on the doctor. It wasn't on Guiteau. And Guiteau loses his life for killing the president. And the doctor, Dr. Bliss, you know, what does he do? He runs immediately to the newspapers and he tries to present a narrative that shows that he did all that he could do to be able to save the president, when in reality, what he was trying to do was to save himself.
Yeah, he was working on his reputation. Charles Guiteau, like you said, he would be executed by hanging in the summer of 1882. And upon James Garfield's death, Chester Arthur would become the 21st president of the United States. And against all expectations, he would work tirelessly tirelessly against the spoil system, against patronage, and for civil service reform, which may be some things we could talk about in another episode. Chris, I think this has been an absolutely fabulous episode. Thank you for your research and your help with this episode. What a wonderful episode. If our listeners have any ideas, comments, or suggestions, they can email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. You can find our podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Sounder FM. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.
What if a school could be there for all of you? Career, family, finances, and mental health. Well, it can. National University, supporting the whole you. Learn more at nu.edu.